All right, here's our must-knows for African Americans. So I'm going to go through people first, then groups, then events and developments, and you're going to add them onto your timeline and see where all these things occurred. So let's bop on up to people. So Phyllis Wheatley, this is like 1750s. So we are in time period 2 in this time period, I believe. And so, fact check me on that. Phyllis Wheatley was actually an enslaved woman who was brought to Boston, New England, might not be Boston, and became the first woman that we know of to African American woman to publish a book. And she was actually a poet and an author. She had been educated by the people who had enslaved her. She knew multiple languages. And that kind of challenged this notion of racial inferiority. This is the 1750s. Slavery is growing pretty rapidly in the United States. And there is this completely wrong notion that these people are meant to be enslaved because of a lack of intelligence. That was kind of the social push of the time. And she really challenged that notion, and her life symbolized like resistance through literature and also educating an awareness that slavery is wrong very early on in the 1750s. Or 1760s, 70s, 80s, somewhere around there. Okay. All right. Nat Turner is next. This is 1831. Nat Turner was actually an enslaved man who led a congregation, and his congregation was pretty radical. He believed that he was the chosen one who was meant to end slavery, and he got a message from God, supposedly, to lead a violent rebellion in Southampton, Virginia, I want to say. Let's just say Virginia, be safe. And so he and some of his religious followers murdered about 60 white people. It was depicted in the South as like this horrible killing of men, women, and children, bloodbath. And it was, but it was kind of used as a propaganda method in the South to spread this further deep hatred against enslaved people. It led to a retaliatory killing of about 100 other enslaved people once Nat Turner was caught and executed. So this kind of struck fear into the hearts of Southern slave holders, and we're going to see some of the rebellions we talk about today have the opposite effect. In fact, slave states passed stricter slave codes, limiting education, limiting the right of African Americans to gather in a religious setting without white people present. So that is kind of the unintended consequence of many of these slave rebellions. Moving on to Sojourner Truth. Sojourner Truth is active in the 1860s, 50s, 60s, 70s, pre-Civil War to begin with. She's an abolitionist because she was previously enslaved. She gained her freedom in 1826. Her biggest speech was called Ain't I a Woman? And she kind of like rides the line, that was in the 1850s, of like getting rid of slavery, being an abolitionist, but also talking about how women are second-class citizens as well. And so in this time period, being an African-American woman is super bottom of the totem pole. And because of her faith and her extreme education that she fought for very hard, she's able to bring a little bit of like activism and awareness to racial and gender equality. All right, Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass, again, an escaped slave from Maryland, I believe, and one of the most prominent and well-known abolitionists. He wrote his own narrative called The Narrative Life of Frederick Douglass, all about the horrors and brutality of slavery, and it was a pretty good bestseller. It was behind Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was written by a white woman, Harriet Beecher Stowe, but still up there in some of the bestsellers and most read books of the day. He also fought for women's rights. He was very good friends with Susan B. Anthony, and he pushed for the ending of black slavery, the enfranchisement of African Americans, and the enfranchisement of women. And actually, his second wife ended up marrying a white woman, which is like, whoa, in the time period. Okay. Harriet Tubman. Here it says Black Moses. The way she got that name was by leading people away from slavery on the Underground Railroad. She's known as one of the most famous conductors on the Underground Railroad. Again, that is symbolic. It's not a real railroad. It is a system of houses and safe places that African Americans took going from the south into the north. She was from Maryland. And crossed over and went back actually to get her family, and then continued going back on multiple trips, risking her own life to free over 300 enslaved people. And that's how she got the name Black Moses, referencing Moses in Exodus in the Bible. She also, during the Civil War, was a scout and spy for the Union Army and led some military raids that freed enslaved people. She's fantastic. All right, so let's think post Civil War now. We're still in time period 5. But this is the Reconstruction era. So for a very short amount of time, military Reconstruction in the South is ensuring freedoms for African Americans. We get the Freedmen's Bureau teaching them how to read and write. Adults all the way down to itty bitty kindergartners going to school and gaining an education. We have African Americans registering to vote, African Americans getting employment. And one of the effects of this tiny, small amount of time during military radical Reconstruction, that African Americans are guaranteed their protections because the Union Army is enforcing that in the South. We get some African American senators and representatives in federal Congress, as well as in local Congresses, state and local. So the first African American to serve in the U.S. Senate represented Mississippi, and his name was Hiram Revels. He had been a minister, an educator, and technically he's filling the Senate seat of Jefferson Davis, who had been a senator from Mississippi before, which is insane. You might want to fact check me on that one. So this shows like some radical, significant movement in the civil rights for African Americans. However, most of these federal senators, there was Hiram Revels, there was another one, will not make it very long because it's tough to be a Black man in federal Congress at this time. And it's hard to even make it to Washington, D.C. because of the mass discrimination against African Americans. Okay, moving on into probably more like time period 7-ish. Ida B. Wells, she is active in the like late 1800s, think like 1890s into the early 1900s. And she is a journalist. So think almost like a muckraker. Think like progressive era muckraker. So squarely in time period 7. And she writes some very famous pieces about lynching. So lynching is like a mob attack at someone with the intent to murder them. And the people who do the lynching often get away with it because of the discrimination of the South and the all-white juries that they are tried on in court. The reason she got really into this is that 3 of her friends were murdered by a white mob in the 1890s. And so she begins like collecting stories and statistics and publishing those things, raking up the mud, a muckraker. She also helped co-found the NAACP, which we're going to talk about later. Okay. So Booker T. Washington's next. We are still in time period. Could say 7-ish. Booker T. Washington is mostly famous for in 1895 the Atlanta Compromise speech. I'll get to that here in a second. He's the co-founder of NAACP, the Tuskegee Institute, which is meant to educate African Americans squarely in like vocational education, job training. In his Atlanta Compromise speech, he advocates for economic self-reliance. Let's us, as an African-American community, build ourselves up in the economy. And then all the social stuff, like whites will start to respect us, was the idea here. So part of his like controversial ideas is he's more moderate. He says, for now, let's accept social segregation. Whereas his like opposite, W.E.B. Du Bois, is next. Same time period, founding... Did I say Booker T. Washington founded the NAACP? I am so sorry. I skipped ahead. That is W.E.B. Du Bois. He helps co-found the NAACP with Ida B. Wells. And he's the one that is like, no, we will stop segregation now. We will have complete equality now. He did promote the idea of the talented 10th, which is like promoting higher education for African Americans, full civil rights, full political representation. He wrote a very famous book called The Souls of Black Folk. And so he's just like this very educated voice against Booker T. Washington. Both of them are trying to achieve the same thing, but in different ways. All right, moving on. A. Philip Randolph mostly popular in the like labor issues of the 1920s. A. Philip Randolph was a labor leader who found a black labor union for sleeping car porters. So back then, trains is how you traveled the country, not automobiles. And there would be sleeping cars. And they would kind of have like flight attendants. Think like a flight attendant, but on a train. And so this is the first like recognized major black union. He also, during World War II, so again in time period 7, kind of pushed for a new executive order that FDR did pass to desegregate the defense industry, not the military, but defense plants, which was a big win for African Americans. All right, where are we here? We are at Martin Luther King Jr., which is an easy one. So Martin Luther King Jr. Is... Again, we're looking in the like 1950s and early 60s. The leader of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. He is a preacher who promotes civil rights through nonviolence. And his most famous work is Letter from a Birmingham Jail, which you probably read in AP Gov if you took it, which is all about the like common sense that segregation completely denies, the common sense that splitting people up goes against, and how it goes against our American government and the principles of the Constitution. He was arrested multiple times for his nonviolent tactics, and also he was assassinated in 1968. All right, Rosa Parks. She actually was an NAACP member. This is, again, in the 1960s. Rosa Parks started the Montgomery bus boycott, not because she was a sweet old lady coming home from work, but she volunteered to get arrested for not moving for a white person to take her spot on the bus boycott. The bus boycott lasted for over a year. It really hurt the transportation industry in Montgomery. And she's kind of seen as the leader of that, to try and promote this economic revolution that was completely peaceful, no bloodshed. All right, we have talked about Malcolm X. Malcolm X is a black nationalist leader. He was the leader of a group of black Muslims, and they advocated for civil rights in a different way. They were tired with how slow things were coming, and instead wanted to progress things, kind of using fear as a tactic, using black power and black pride as a tactic as well. But he also promoted self-defense. There's lots of targeting of African Americans in like the criminal sphere, even when it's obvious the evidence is not there. And so Malcolm X and the Black Panthers, which two separate things but kind of have similar ideas, promote this idea of we will protect our communities. And they had like guards made up of young African American men who like patrol the black communities. All right, moving on. Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee is SNCC. Stokely Carmichael is one of the leaders. John Lewis is actually one of the leaders as well, which John Lewis is not on here. Kind of makes me sad. This is 1960s again. They advocate for black power, sometimes even like black separatism, but not like segregation, like such pride in being black that you keep yourself separate because you want to. And then lastly, Barack Obama, 2008, Yes, We Can was his slogan, first African-American president of the United States, and is just this historic symbol of progress as written here, because 100 years prior, African Americans were still being lynched. 100 years prior, most colleges did not accept African Americans. And here we have this boy who was born to a single mom in Hawaii, kind of like started from the bottom, now we're here, is now a president, and he's black. And that just shows, it's just such a shift in American history to have that representation of the African American community. All right, I'm talking way too much. Here we go. Groups to know. Let's talk about exodusters. Exodusters are post-Reconstruction. They are people who exodus out of post-Civil War South. So those opportunities after Reconstruction ended, And the Union Army was like taken away in 1876, the Compromise of 1877, that whole thing. African Americans fled the South due to that racial violence, lack of opportunity. So they went to places like Kansas and other parts of the West. And it was pretty strong in a sense of like, that's where a lot of those places get their Black community. Speaking of a lot of places getting their Black community, do I have Great Migration on here? Yes, I do. I'll talk about that later. Okay. NAACP, we've kind of already covered with Ida B. Wells and Booker T. Washington, but NAACP starts in 1909, I believe, and goes to the present, but is most active in the early 1900s during the Progressive Era, and then during the Civil Rights Movement. They would become the lawyers of people who were arrested, who were protesting for civil rights, in sit-ins, in bus boycotts, and marches, and they would try to fight segregation and civil rights issues in the courts, okay? Harlem Renaissance. This is 1920s New York City, a neighborhood in Manhattan called Harlem, has this huge just upswing of culture. And we have huge names like Langston Hughes, What Happens to a Dream Deferred, Zora Neale Hurston, Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong's my favorite, a bunch of musicians and poets and artists, explosion of arts about Black identity. And it almost makes a political statement. We are proud of who we are, and we're not going to hide it anymore. And we get jazz music from this. So thank you, Harlem Renaissance. All right, Tuskegee Airmen is next. The Tuskegee Airmen are people who served an African-American air unit, who served in World War II prior to the military being desegregated. So we are proving like this whole military not being segregated in World War II, not being desegregated, it won't be desegregated until 1948. You could read that on your timeline. This whole African-Americans fought for our country and come home and go to subservient schools and have subservient jobs. And so the Tuskegee Airmen kind of like are this one group of super courageous aviators who kind of show people that that's the reality of being African American. You can be a hero on the warfield and then come home and be segregated. Southern Christian Leadership Conference, we kind of covered. This is 1960s, nonviolent, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. SNCC actually ends up being a little bit more, I don't want to say violent. They were a nonviolent organization, but they were more student-led. So they had some more like radical approaches like sit-ins, teach-ins. They kind of melded into the Black Power movement at the end, but it empowered young people. Where the Southern Christian Leadership Conference was all about like the Baptist church, and that really spoke to the old people. SNCC really spoke to the young people. They did the freedom rides on the Greyhound buses across the United States. They did voter registration for young people at colleges. They encouraged you to try to get educated, go to historically Black colleges, things like that. Black Panthers we have talked about as well. The Black Panthers were found in Oakland, California, and the goal was to protect Black people from police brutality. They advocated self-defense. They had free breakfast for children. They had big health clinics. They were not a nonviolent group, though. They used more militant rhetoric. They openly carried firearms. The FBI kind of had them on their watch list. But it was a bold move. And then finally, Black Lives Matter there. Black Lives Matter was like a social media hashtag that started in, I want to say 2013. Don't quote me on that. With the death of a Black man, Trayvon Martin. And it kind of went into this whole global movement in 2020 with the killing of George Floyd by a police officer. And it kind of sparked all these big protests during the COVID era in 2020. Black Lives Matter as a movement pushes for defunding police, ending police brutality, criminal justice reform to make the proportion of African Americans in the justice system less, and racial equality. And so it's kind of like our new generational movement of civil rights. All right. Oh my gosh, I'm talking so much. We only have a few more. Events and developments, we get the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage was like the horrific sea journey that enslaved Africans were forced to endure on their way to the Americas. Little food, no sanitation, chained to the deck. Millions died, laying in your own excrement. It's all part of that like triangle trade system where raw goods are stripped from the colonies, sent to England, money is made, they go pick up slaves in Africa and bring them to the New World to start it all over again. And so that trauma of the Middle Passage is how African American slavery started, and what a tone to set. Stoner Rebellion 1793 was one of the first major slave revolts, and just like Nat Turner's rebellion that we talked about, or if you remember Great Gabriel Prosser's rebellion, it has the opposite effect. This one's in South Carolina. A group of enslaved Africans steal weapons. They kill white colonists. They try to make it to Florida. Florida was owned by the Spanish. The Spanish had promised, if you come to Florida, you'll be free. It was quickly suppressed, but it terrified the slaveholders. So the slaveholders did stricter slave codes. All right, moving on. 13th Amendment. 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. Put them all on there. These are our Reconstruction Amendments. They abolished slavery and involuntary servitude. And it didn't quite have that, the Civil War had ended. Technically, we had the Emancipation Proclamation, which should be on here too. But that was mid-Civil War, but there was no like teeth behind it. There was no enforcement because the Union hadn't won. Then by the time we get to 1865, the Union has won. We have a radical Republican majority in Congress. They get the 13th Amendment, which is freeing slaves, the 14th Amendment, which is giving them citizenship, and the 15th Amendment, which is enfranchising them, giving them the right to vote, all passed very quickly in the next few years after the Civil War. Great Migration is time period 7, 1910s. This says to 1970. I kind of disagree with that. I would say that it ends in the 6th. Just roll with it, whatever. So there are urban opportunities in the North, particularly during World War I and World War II. So your World War I dates are 1914, 1918, but America's not involved until 1918. Your World War II dates are 1939 to 1945, but America's not involved until 1941. So there are war jobs, less racial discrimination, less Jim Crow laws, and less poor economic conditions in the North. And so African Americans kind of move up and build these vibrant Black communities. And this is where we get the Harlem Renaissance from. This is where we get new civil rights activism from. This is where a lot of cities that we know and love get their Black population from. Cincinnati has a large Black population. So does Louisville. Those people came, their family history, a lot of them came during the Great Migration. All right, 1921, not all is fine and dandy. It's not all Harlem Renaissance-y everywhere. In Tulsa, Oklahoma, there is a Black neighborhood that is just like thriving. They used to call it Black Wall Street. Oh, good, that's on here. And a white mob just burns it to the ground. 300 Black residents were killed. The community just done for. It all was sparked from a false accusation that a white woman said that a Black man flirted with her or assaulted her or something like that. It was all false. And it just showed that one little false accusation, because of the deep racial resentment in this post-World War I America, led to the death and destruction of over 300 different people and all of their buildings and all of their thriving business in Tulsa. It's like one of the most powerful examples of racial violence. All right, World War II, 1942, 1945. The Double V campaign is the idea that it started in Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania somewhere. And it was the idea that called for 2 V's: victory against fascism abroad, so that's like Japan and Germany, and victory against racism at home. So the Double V campaign, and like think peace sign V. African American soldiers, again, are serving in the war. They come home, they're segregated against. They're demanding equal rights while contributing to the war effort. All right, Brown v. Board. I'm almost done. Brown v. Board of Education declared that racial segregation in public schools was unconstitutional, overturning Plessy versus Ferguson, that separate but equal doctrine. Thurgood Marshall is the NAACP lawyer that heads this and says that separate is inherently unequal because the funding doesn't follow that. That's one of the reasons. Implementation was so slow, though. Just because 1954 is the date of this does not mean that schools were desegregated immediately. Little Rock 9 doesn't even happen until 1959. Some schools are so slow to desegregate. There's the Southern Manifesto where like all these southern like little towns come together and they're like, we're not going to do that. We're not going to desegregate. We have white flight where a bunch of white people rip their kids out of public school, put them in private school because private school could discriminate at the time. Finally, the LA riots. This is in time period 9. 4 Los Angeles Police Department officers beat Rodney King, a black man, and they are acquitted. And all these like violent protests erupt across Los Angeles in 1992. It lasts 6 days. Several businesses are destroyed. 60 people are dead. $1 million of damage. And it just exposes that the race issue is not done. It's 1992 and we still haven't solved this. It brought to light the more current civil rights movement prior to Black Lives Matter, that the issues of civil rights are no longer segregation. The issues are policing, the justice system, and systematic racism. All right, that is all you need to know about African Americans.